Iowa Soybean Association is driven to deliver for Iowa's 40,000 soybean farmers. We're proud to provide objective agronomic research, a helping hand with soil and water stewardship, and timely industry news powered by the Soybean Checkoff. Learn more at iasoybeans.com.
Showing you a different side of the MTOM podcast studio here. This is the audio waveforms. That's my voice being transmitted to you and what it looks like in editing. And what it looks like right now and the words that you're going to hear are about the state of agriculture in the state of Arkansas. Specifically, a meeting caught our attention in the last couple of weeks where farmers came together in the middle of harvest. Their rice, their cotton, their soybeans, their corn, those are the big four in the state. And producers are involved in all of those, but it is a very crucial time for them. Part of the one big beautiful bill, the skinny farm bill section that was in there, does not kick in until 2026, which means some producers are extremely vulnerable to what's happening right now as policy decisions, specifically on trade and tariffs and what they mean to these farmers. It is not good. It was a very intense meeting. We've posted a couple of the pictures from there on our social pages so you can see, and some of you may not know what's going on there, but you do now. So we're going to get into what these farmers are going through, what they're trying to hope can come in policy in the short term and in the long term, what can benefit them, and we'll look at some of the positives as well in the M2M podcast with Dr. Ryan Loy from the University of Arkansas. He's in agricultural economics. We'll discuss some financial things, some bankruptcy filings that are up, and what else is going on in that state and what is similar to other grain states. That's this week's M2M podcast. I'm Paul Yeager. New episodes come out each and every Tuesday here from Market to Market and Iowa PBS. You spent enough time in Stillwater. We're going to start with Eskimo Joe's. Did you go back for the 50th anniversary party this summer?
No, I didn't, but I kept up with it. It looked like a blast. I haven't been back to Stillwater as much as I want to. University of Arkansas keeps me busy, all good things. But, going to Joe's as a student, I will tell you that when I first started there, I thought I was going to be going to Joe's more often than I really did. Then reality of college hit me, and I'm like, I can't even afford to get a haircut, let alone go to get cheese fries and beer, right? So, that's a great place.
Times change. It's an institution there. And in the email talk, I asked for your best Dr. Darrell Peel story. Surely you have one, right?
I wish I did. He was always very fascinating to me as a student, and kind of one of the reasons that I got interested in extension role in terms of what extension means. Watching him come and lecture to us as undergraduates, whether it was guest lectures. I do remember one time that the class was being a little bit rowdy and they had to rail it back in pretty quickly. And that was something I don't want to see again. It wasn't Dr. Peel, it was the other professor whose class it actually was. But that was probably the one that, that comes to mind the most. I worked a lot in the row crop sector when I was doing stuff down there. So I didn't work with Dr. Peel directly, although we've become good friends since then. So he's a great mentor and a great, great professor.
He's always nice with his time with us, always one of our more popular guests that we've had on this podcast. People do want to hear. They still want to listen. Heck, they still bring him up to Iowa to do sessions in Dubuque or something. He was there this year. But you're from Texas, spend a lot of time in Oklahoma. You're now in Arkansas. What's the similarities between those three in agriculture?
Oh, that's a great question. Well, where I'm from in Texas is a non-ag, part of Texas. I'm from, the Dallas area, a little bit north Dallas, about Plano. And so I grew up in a big city. And really, when I grew up, I had no idea what agriculture even was, what it meant, But I did know that food didn't come just from the grocery store. Don't know why I knew that, but that made sense to me. And so I joined FFA just because I was like, hey, this is a very interesting, area, and fell in love with it. And so from that perspective, I always say Arkansas is one of the most diverse in terms of agriculture states I've ever seen. Oklahoma has diversity as well, but, the big big things over there are wheat and cattle, right? And then Texas, my area of Texas, had some corn, some wheat, but nothing to the degree that Arkansas has. Arkansas is very unique in that it's compared to other states I've lived in where, urban sprawl kind of takes over an area and nothing that was there is left. In Arkansas, it almost seems like the cities and towns and houses are all built around those sorts of things. So you're kind of always surrounded by agriculture and just wilderness here. And so I would say that Oklahoma and Texas are a little bit, closer in similarity, but Arkansas is very, very unique in all the good ways.
Well, in Texas, we could talk about zoning laws and planning that's a whole nother session, and probably
That's
some of
right.
your friends that went into that. Let's talk Arkansas specific. Your job there at the university is to look at all things. Tell me about, we're very familiar, this audience, heavily corn and soybeans, and understand the price challenges. What are some of the crops that are facing price challenges in Arkansas right now?
Well, of course, as you'd mentioned, corn and soybeans, those are big ones that are really facing that price slide right now. Rice, of course, we produce, the most rice in terms of states. Now, soybeans are our number one crop in terms of acreage, but we are number one in rice as well in terms of compared across the country. And so when we're looking at those three big commodities, that's really what we're talking about here. There's some wheat here as well, but really corn, soybeans, rice, and cotton. So cotton as well. Cotton is another one of those that's really been in a bad spot for quite some time at this point. And it's really difficult to pencil that. Rice, on the other hand, the biggest thing for rice is talking about the milling percentages and going to the mill. And so the milling yield that they get, versus what their field yield actually is, well, they get paid on that milling, right? So whatever, just like wheat, basically, right? They have to mill it out, take out the bran and all that sort of thing to get ready for market. And here recently, it seems that the milling yields have been pretty poor. And so it's really impacting farmers' bottom line. And so when you look at prices, comparatively speaking, across the board, all of them are down. But when you're predominantly soybeans, rice, and corn, this really exacerbates that situation to an extreme.
Well, I
Another
want to
thing, go
I
ahead,
want to go
please.
with rice there for a minute, though,
Yeah.
Ryan. Help me understand the market for that, and is trade and global partners as big of an impact on the rice market and its price?
It has an impact, absolutely, but it's not the same impact as soybeans. Let's take soybeans, for example. So one of the big things in soybeans is that China is just not buying them, right? That's the retaliation in the trade war. They're not buying them. We don't have a downstream market right now for our soybeans. And when you don't have that market and you have that same supply with no demand, those prices are going to follow, right? Rice is a little bit different. Now, China doesn't buy our rice. We go into, Africa, some of the Caribbean areas, and then over into like Mexico and stuff like that. But what's really kind of kicking us on the rice side is that a lot of Southeast Asian countries, let's talk about India or even Thailand, Vietnam, they're really having a big uptick in their rice production. And so when you look at it from that perspective, when they have that uptick in rice production, you know, there's a quality level and kind of something that they look at and care about a lot more. And so when they go on the global market, they're cheaper and they're mostly the quality that these other countries in the Southeast Asia countries want to purchase. And so when you have that big supply that gets flooded into the market, those prices drop. And so it's really difficult to be competitive against those other countries right now in terms of rice. India had the export ban for about a year's time, and then they opened the floodgates back up at the beginning of last year. And so since then, they've really just kind of, there's just been a huge excess supply on the market. And because of that, prices have really followed. Again, when we get into those milling yields, like I was talking about, that really impacts quality. And so if those milling yields are not good, or at least not what they expect, then that quality gets diminished, and the demand for that on the back end kind of falls, and then they look for other countries to purchase that. And so we've seen that in Mexico a little bit, and stuff like that, especially when they had their inflation decree.
And with it sounds very familiar to the soybean story,
Yes.
a very flooded market. And South America is the big competitor with us with the China market. Cotton has been also something, though, but cotton was still heading to China, right? Has that been more of a tariff story? I always hear about the export story. Is that true?
Yes, absolutely. When we're talking about exporting the cotton, right, of raw cotton, we're going to be that net exporter of the cotton, right, and net importer of the finished cotton, right. And so when we're looking at that, what ends up happening is if we're going to China to sell that cotton or going elsewhere, going to Mexico, some other textile hub, um, right now it's going to get tariffed on going out. And then when it gets created into a good, it's going to get tariffed coming back in. And so all that does is raise the price for an everyday consumer to buy that good. Well, the comparative aspect to that, and where kind of the counterfactual is that a lot of these synthetic fibers are becoming more and more popular, and those aren't having the same impact right now as what cotton is having. And so when you're looking at it, it's becoming more expensive, and because it becomes more expensive, that demand drops and the prices that those farmers receive gets low. And so cotton's a very interesting one, right? Because if you are, a corn, soybean, or rice farmer, you can buy one piece of equipment and change the header out. But when you are talking about cotton, you have the cotton picker, and that's all you can use it for. And so it's difficult to spread that cost out, across everything, right? And so it becomes very expensive to produce with very little revenue received on the back end. And there's quality, things that they have to adhere to. There's so many things when we're talking about just specific cotton, production risk, financial risk that the farmers face. And it's very difficult to make it pencil, even in a great year.
So the Arkansas farmer already knows there's those challenges with cotton when it comes to the quality and where it can go in the markets. The rice, you never know if it's going to rain enough or rain too much to impact you. Soybeans and corn, you just face the common weather story. So those are common. And then the trade and the tariff story is another factor. So where is the sentiment? We talk about Purdue with the sentiment. The University of Michigan has a sentiment. What's the sentiment anecdotally, Ryan, of the Arkansas farmer right now?
Well, right now, I think anecdotally, and you had mentioned that meeting that the Arkansas farmers had a few weeks ago, that grassroots meeting where they basically all came together. Hundreds of farmers came together to share their concerns. And a big topic of conversation was, we need those export markets and we need those international relationships, right? It's not the case of, a lot of these farmers over time have gone out and built these relationships, and they go out and they visit these countries and the countries come here and they build these relationships themselves, right? And so to have that kind of ripped away from a political standpoint is very difficult. And so the sentiment is not good, right? So on the export side of things, we have retaliation. China's not going to buy our soybeans. Other countries may also want to retaliate as well. But really, when we're talking about soybeans, again, in terms of acreage, that's number one. If we don't have that downstream market, where are we going to go with it and how do we make money? That's a concern. On the other side, with these commodity prices dropping, the inputs to grow those commodities have just steadily increased. They've kind of increased always over time, but really started having that uptick around the first trade war and has really just maintained staying high. And especially when you add tariffs on top of that, because if we import a majority of our fertilizer, come up the Mississippi River or come up other ways, come down through rail through Canada, when that's tariffed, I mean, you're taking already expensive good, adding another expense, a tax on top of it. And then a farmer turns around and says, how am I supposed to make this work? And one of the important things, when we're talking about this here is that what's going on right now is really not due at all to poor money management on a farmer's part, right? They do everything marketing, they cut costs, they handle everything, and they've got things pretty sewed up tight and solid. But there's these outside market factors that are occurring right now that just makes it very difficult for them. One of the biggest things I've been talking about recently is this uptick in Chapter 12 bankruptcy filings. And Chapter 12 bankruptcy is just a special provision of bankruptcy for family farmers. And Arkansas specifically, just in the second quarter of this year, we had 16 bankruptcies just in the second quarter alone. And I went back and looked at numbers just from the early 2000s, from pretty back far, and we have never seen that number in the second quarter. And when we're looking at this really big uptick, when you look at filings on a national level, around 2018, they started really upticking, right, during that first trade war. Then we had a lot of that pandemic assistance come in. It dropped down, right, because that helped people, and we were very low. And now what we're seeing is this resurgence. And to me, it's sending a warning sign. I think that we see around. That these financial stressors are returning to rural America. And, a lot of things are going into that. You've got those export markets, low commodity prices, input costs, and from the Delta standpoint, the Arkansas Delta standpoint, just the rented land, right? And so we have a very high percentage of rented land. That's an additional expense on top. An additional expense without an asset base now, right? So if you don't have that asset base, trying to, loan against something is difficult. Trying to go through Chapter 12 is difficult, right? Because you don't have that asset base that you could have had if you own the land. And that's something that's very unique for our farmers down here in the Arkansas Delta.
You said to the early 2000s. There's still the 1980s that resonates in a big part of ag for the crisis. Since you looked at those numbers, does it make you want to pull numbers back even further, or is that an apples and oranges now because things have changed with agriculture in your state?
I think that there is. I could say that pretty confidently that the 80s ones are probably at this point higher, because of just, again, there was no asset base to the degree there is now in agriculture back then. And so the point is that there definitely needs to be looked at as well in terms of comparatively speaking. And I think that it's not an apples to oranges comparison, but, prices were different and input costs were different as well. And also just the amount that somebody would be borrowing, you look at the federal funds rate, which is just short-term interest rates of 18% at that time. Well, you ask yourself, but what was the magnitude of what they were borrowing at that, right? Compared to what they're borrowing at the 8% right now or 6% right now, right?
So is it 20,000 versus 2 million?
That's exactly right.
Okay, I get you there. All right, let's go. Also, one other thing you said there before was about the family side of thing. There's a theory online that I have seen involving Arkansas in this specific meeting last week, that this is an attempt that could dramatically change the family farmer to a very large agribusiness way of doing things. Do we have concerns? Are there flashing lights that is a legitimate concern for the economy of Arkansas agriculture?
It's interesting because I've seen some theories on that too. And I think what they're kind of referring to is a lot of, private equity or people from outside of the state coming in and purchasing and buying up the land once if these farms were to go under. And a couple things there, right? The size of the farm doesn't necessarily constitute it to be a family farm or not, right? Most farms are family farms, even if they're massive, operations, right? And so, the family farms, I think, are still going to stick around and they're going to be here. The question then becomes, at what point is it, not a profitable endeavor for these private equity firms or firms that are non-ag, I'll call it that, non-ag firms who come in and buy the land? At what point is it not a cost effective for them to do that, right? When you're thinking about investing in land versus, some other alternative investment opportunity, and you look at yield on maybe some, treasuries or something along those lines that you could invest in, at what point does the interest that you're going to pay to have that land, does it make it not as attractive to do anymore? I still don't think that we've seen that. But the real major concern with that is, let's say hypothetically, they're always going to buy land because it's an inflation hedge no matter what. And they're going to continue to do that. Well, the issue becomes, And I equate it to kind of like renting a home almost, where if you're renting a home from somebody that is in the community and well, maybe if you're late on rent for 2 days or something happened at the house, you can have a conversation with that person, and more often than not, things are going to work out. But if you're renting from a corporate entity or one that has no, roots in the community, you can't have those same kind of discussions, right? And so from the farmer's perspective, they're trying to negotiate a lease for the land. Those become less of a negotiation and less of they have to be price takers on what they'd offer. That is a really big concern for the Delta. And once it's out of ag and once it's owned by these other entities, it'd be very difficult to bring it back in and fully owned by the agriculture community.
One thing we talk about speculators in the market and the outside money, the managed money that comes in to buy long or short some type of market. And then there's the farmer that says, well, if the funds are going to do this, then when that changes, it's going to change my price. So in a way, and then I have our market analysts that will say, but that managed money and that extra money that's non-farm, but an investment, is actually boosting prices and helping things. If I'm selling the land, it's helping me get a higher price for that land. If I'm the family that's fifth generation, no longer connected, I don't need that headache. I'm going to sell the land. I want to make my money too.
That's right. No, that's absolutely right. And I think too, and that's a very good point that you bring up there. And again, I think it all just comes back down to, again, at the end of the day, you're still part of that community. And if you sell the land and, let's say you sell it to that, some sort of outside entity to do those things, I think that definitely can happen. But in the Delta, people are very aware of that happening. And I think that there is a lot more, even if they can't expand. I've heard anecdotally of some farmers just falling on their sword and making sure that if land comes up around them, that they can at least retain it, buy it, rent it, do whatever they can with it, such that it just stays in agriculture and doesn't leave, right? Because they don't want exorbitant rents, and they really don't want those communities. And a big kicker here in Arkansas, and I'm not sure in Iowa, is solar farms. That's becoming a huge thing. So, it's getting increasingly difficult to say you should farm this land versus what you could get paid for leasing it out to a solar farm, right? And that becomes also a very difficult discussion to have. And in terms of land values, right? If we're looking at land capitalization, right, and commodity prices continue to slump, well, if you capitalize that land that way, it's going to kind of decrease in value. But if you have the solar panels on it and you have that steady income, right, that looks a lot better. And so it's very complicated, and it's one of those things of a culture thing as much as it is a money thing.
And we hear the solar story in areas that might have more than two crops.
Yeah.
Go with me on that. Michigan is in a way similar to Arkansas with it's 4 or 5 crops, not 2.
That's
In
right.
Iowa, Illinois, we're pretty much 2. It's corn and beans. The diversity, which then exposes it to more volatility, but it also spreads out your risk.
That's right.
But that lease payment of the solar farm is something I can count on.
That's right. And I think
but you know it, Ryan, once that land is out of production and it gets ripped up and done for whatever they have to do to solar, it's not coming back. It's one you can maybe eventually knock down the shopping mall and maybe get that thing back, but tell me the last time you've ever heard that happened.
I don't think in my years I've ever heard of that happening, right? And again, if you're looking at it from a purely a business perspective, longevity for family wealth perspective, if you are faced with a choice of uncertainty of income, right, and you have a certain income that you can at least just say, hey, I'm going to take care of some things around the house and do things. I'm just going to take the year. I think we're seeing a lot of people consider that more, right?
Mm-hmm.
And
Okay.
increasingly becoming more production risk around here too with extreme weather. So prevent plant is going to be a big deal this year as well, in terms of, hey, is it even worth me replanting because I'm going to lose money, or I can just take this certainty right now of what I could have gotten. And so it's going to be a discussion that we're going to have more in the future, no doubt.
Yeah, I heard one of your colleagues on Arkansas PBS say last week that, yes, you had the weather issue at the beginning of the year and kind of set things back. Let's go back to the meeting if we could.
Yes, sir.
Is there policy that can change things? Because some of the things you've talked about as economic and policy from the government is really going to artificially change some things. What are these farmers asking for when it comes to policy?
One of the big things that they're asking for, let's go back to the one big beautiful bill that got passed. Within that, there was what they're calling basically a skinny farm bill that really updates a lot of the outdated commodities price supports and just commodity supports in general. That was from the 2014 farm bill. So it really brought that into the modern age. But the kicker with that is that a lot of that does not trigger until 2026. Right. So ARC and PLC, that won't, you can't get any payments for that until 2026. And so the issue now that farmers are asking for, and a big reason that that meeting occurred, was how do I get to 2026? Right? We need immediate relief. And so, the farmers are really asking for immediate relief to get to 2026. And so from policy perspective, that looks like, just some governmental disaster payments to come through. Now, this is much different than, some of the actual disaster payments that they had from true disasters, true physical climate disasters. This is because of, again, this is in due part to policy as well, right? If the policy is isolationism and we are going to tariff everybody, well, they can retaliate. And unfortunately, the pawn in that is going to be the farmer, right? They're going to be the first ones attacked because that's kind of the Achilles heel. And so really they're asking for immediate support to get to 2026. So that way they can get some of these supports that were passed earlier. They really need support in terms of developing these markets again, right? And figuring out how these tariffs won't directly impact the farmer, right? Not only on the output side in terms of retaliation, but on the input side to just grow it. It's astronomical. It really is.
Does this all get saved if China comes and buys a few cargoes of soybeans?
I think that's a Band-Aid on this, right? Because and this is just, my opinion based on what I can see in the data and what, we can see in terms of trade. I think that the China ship physically, metaphorically, has really sailed overall. And I think that this has been a slow shift since 2018, since the first trade war. If you think about it from a business perspective, right? If I'm China and commodities are on the whole, not saying that they actually are, but if commodities are all the same, I have a better relationship with Brazil and I can get it cheaper. So why on earth, do you see what I'm kind of saying? So from China's perspective, they're like, even if everything goes right, even if everything's fixed in terms of relationships and this, why would I continue to buy from the United States when I can just go to Brazil? They've got multiple harvests a year. They're first on the market. And at the end of the day, they're just cheaper. And so that really is the big thing. And so, look, China can come and buy from us, but we are extremely reliant on them. They're not relying on us anymore because they can shift their purchases where it's very difficult to shift our soybean sales elsewhere because of the amount that China typically would buy compared to even the number two that we sell to, which is the UK. I mean, we're talking $10 billion worth between first and second, right? I mean, there's a lot of space between that. So it'd be difficult to spread that out amongst other countries. Not saying it can't be done, but it would be a lot of growing pains in the interim.
One thing that this administration campaigned on and it talks a lot about is what's fair and unfair practices. If we weren't getting a good fair deal with China, or if we weren't getting a good fair deal with Mexico and Canada, and why we ripped up NAFTA and went with USMCA, it sounds like the farmer is caught again in trying to get a better, more fair, equitable. But at the end of the day, it's still just down to price, is what I think I'm hearing you say, Ryan.
That's really it. I mean, when we're talking about, again, we can build up these relationships, we can make trade fair, if that's that's the goal. But at the end of the day, people want cheap goods, and that's what they're going to go for.
At the end of the day, are we also going to have the ability to domestically consume and produce the items that are needed for agriculture operation? Can we make the fertilizer that we need? Can we make it but can we make it profitable? Can we eat all that rice, but can we make it at a price that's sustainable to the Arkansas farmer?
I think the short answer, and definitely in the short term, is no. I mean, we first of all, we don't. Some of it when it comes down to fertilizers, we don't have the natural resources to make them in the first place, right? So from potash from Canada, we can't make that, and we have to buy it from them, and it's a very important input. And so from that perspective, we can't. And one of the biggest things too is that if trade policy isn't written in blood, meaning that it's not going to change, it's difficult to find a situation where somebody will invest in this in a sector, right? So let's bring factories back or something like that. Well, if one day it's 100% tariff on your competition good, then the next day it's 0%, and the next day it's, with the uncertainty surrounding that, how would you make that big investment and ensure that it would be a good one to make, right? And so from that perspective, it's difficult to create that domestic market for those things. But first, we just don't have that sort of labor, right? We don't have the labor. People say, well, technology will come through and they can handle it that way. Sure, that could happen. Definitely not in the short term. But then also you asked about rice consumption and soybean consumption. On the soybean consumption, we're getting better in terms of domestic consumption, but it still is nothing to be able to fill that need of the supply that we have. Rice the same way, right? Rice is the exact same way. We just don't have I love rice, but we don't have as big of an appetite for rice as other
Correct.
countries, comparably
Yep.
speaking, right?
That's right. When you one more thing from one of your previous comments about bankruptcies, and you were looking at those numbers, is that something now that you're going to have to look into from your research purposes and see what was the reason for some of those to help glean more information, or are you just going to have to be more tracking numbers and just report what's happening?
It's more along the lines when you talk about the bankruptcy numbers, the way they're reported from the courts, it's just a number and it's sometimes attached to a county. So hypothetically, the 16 bankruptcies that I mentioned earlier could just be a very small, a peach farm or something like that as an example. I don't mean to pick on peaches, but take a specialty crop farm, very small, right? Just a few acres. It could be that. It definitely could, but the context surrounding what's going on and knowing how many farm auctions we've had in the Delta this year, it tells me that it's definitely these commercial row crop farms that are facing this right now. And so from your question, I think right now it's more of tracking numbers and applying context to it because it's very difficult to kind of tease out why that happened. And it's even more difficult to tease out, were they successful in going through Chapter 12? Or was this just kind of a delaying the inevitable situation?
Are we in the middle of the worst right now?
I would say we're in the middle of, to me, it seems like the worst, but it seems about every month I wake up and it gets worse, in terms of this year specifically. I think right now we're in the worst, and mainly because as of this time, China still has not bought any soybeans from us. And at least I don't care if it was 2018, the first trade war, whatever it was, they were at least buying something from us. And right now they still have not done that. And so to see that actually come to fruition, talking about it at the beginning of the year where we didn't really know, and then actually seeing this play out, I think we're really in the worst of it. Although I think that around harvest, if this still keeps up, soybean harvest, if this still keeps up, that would be the worst.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask, is what would be the next step, this, and how does this get better? Let's try to end, Ryan, on some positive.
Absolutely. I love that because I feel like Dr. Doom sometimes.
You're too early to have that nickname, Ryan, in your career. You can't get that yet.
I know. For me, it really comes down to, okay, so we talked about, one of the things I did in my dissertation was value-added marketing. And I know that it's a difficult thing to do for people. It is because it costs money. It takes a lot of time. But, there are still farms that are, I'll put it this way, that are doing okay because they have created a value-added marketing chain for their commodities. They have a downstream market. They produce for that market. And whether it's a company, whether it's, a company in a different country that they have an agreement with, whatever it is. And it seems that that's going to be one of the things of the future in terms of how to weather these kinds of storms, right? Coming together, creating a product, having that differentiation from that commodity, decommoditizing these goods, and working through that way. There's edamame here in Arkansas. That's a great example on the soybean side in terms of how it can be, managed in terms of the export markets lost. Well, okay, I have edamame that can maybe offset some of that, and rice the same way.
That's possible. Then we have to find an outlet and build that market, just like
That's right.
soybeans used to not be as produced as much as they were, but we found ways to use them, and these other crops, and the value addedness that's one thing that we still talk about in rural America. This show for sure has talked about that for years, going back to the 80s and 70s when we started. Value added's always been a part of it. So Ryan, I appreciate your insight there from Arkansas. Thank you so very much for the time.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
New episodes every Tuesday. Like, rate, review, share. Really like if you do that share thing with a friend. We'll see you next time. Thank you.